Some of the content contained in this podcast may prove challenging to some listeners. Discretion is advised. Please contact a member of your local support group or a relevant and accredited support organisation if affected and help is required. Hi, and welcome to My Service, My Story, a collaborative podcast between the Warragul RSL and the Warragul and Druin Gazette. My name is Nicholas Duck. I'm a journalist for the Warragul and Druin Gazette, and joining me today is Rod McNab. Rod, welcome.
Thank you, Nicholas.
And we'll get stuck straight into it. So, Rod, if you wanted to start by telling us a bit about your early life, your childhood, where you grew up, and all that sort of thing before your service.
Fine. I grew up on a farm out at Athlone, the other side of Druin. Athlone Primary School, Druin Secondary College. Went to Melbourne, finished up at Teachers College. I was called up while I was at Teachers College. We were allowed to defer for a couple of years. So when I went into national service, I was sort of like a mature age recruit. I'd finished college and been allowed to teach for a year and went in, January, February 1968.
So how old were you when you went into service properly?
Must have been 22, because I had my 23rd birthday in Vietnam.
What was the feeling when you got the letter that told you you'd been conscripted?
Well, it was one of those funny things, Nick, because I always felt that I would be.
Felt it in your bones.
I could drive you right now to the letterbox where I posted off my registration papers. I remember it so clearly. I put the envelope in and I said, well, that's that. And I grew up in a household. Dad had trained as a commando in World War II and served as a coast watcher on Bougainville. And so Anzac Day and so on were just part of our household as we grew up. And so being called up to do national service wasn't any big deal for me.
No, so you've been used to it because of your family history.
Well, on top of that, I mean, I'd left home at 17 to play football in Melbourne, and going into an environment where there's a whole lot of young blokes running around involved in physical activities wasn't a drama or new. It wasn't a hassle. In fact, I quite enjoyed it.
Yeah, okay. What did your father think when he found out you'd been conscripted?
I don't know that I can't remember ever really discussing it. And it's only hit me in recent years, because my mother also served. She was in the auxiliary services.
Oh, wow. Real family of service then.
Yeah. And, I mean, I'll always remember their reaction when I landed home at Essendon Airport. But it never really hit me until later years when I had kids of my own as to how it must have felt for two people who had experienced war, and certainly Dad, in an operational environment, how it must have felt for a son to be there, not really of our own choice, but because of a government policy at the time. I don't think it was ever really discussed, but they never discouraged it either. They never sort of said, I wish you weren't going, or, I'd rather you be here, that sort of thing. They could see that it was pretty well my decision to go the way that I did, and they were always very supportive of that.
Well, it sounds like you'd sort of settled into life a little with your deferment with teaching and whatnot. Were you sad to leave that behind at all?
Not at the time. I think I was quite good at that. And I came back to it after and continued that career and reached the lofty heights of school principal. But in hindsight, I don't think I should have gone back. I didn't handle certain aspects of the education department particularly well, particularly dealing with the bureaucracy, I think. I must have had an adverse reaction to the army bureaucracy and hierarchy, and I saw the education department as a continuation of that, and I wasn't terribly obedient in many respects. I got on very well with the kids and the other teachers, but not so much with the education department.
Right.
So I thought it was better when the situation arose to To resign, I resigned.
Yeah, go out gracefully, bow out. So when you went off to training in Puckapunyal, how did you find everything?
Well, it's very hot, of course.
Seems to be a common theme among everyone who's...
Incredibly hot. And
I don't think anyone we've spoken to has a kind word to say about the climate at Puckapunyal.
well, a lot of the time I spent out on that vast parade ground, and the heat that was reflected up off the asphalt was quite intense. In fact, I can remember one day I used to perspire very easily, and I'm standing there after we've been marching up and down for an hour or so, and perspiration is just running off my face. And the officer in charge of it actually came up and asked me, "Are you okay?"
Jeez, you must have looked...
I didn't feel, it was just normal for me, than footy training and whatnot. I used to sweat a lot, but
Jeez, for them to ask that, you must have looked moments away from keeling over.
Expiring, yeah.
Perspiring until you expire.
But it was challenging. I'd had the good fortune to have a couple of mates go through it beforehand, so I'd had discussions with them, and I knew pretty well what to expect. So all of the nonsense they used to put you through to make things a bit uncomfortable, that wasn't a drama. I could handle that easily. I mean, they were just playing silly games, so I can play them as well.
Did you clash at all with the hierarchy there?
No, not at all. In fact, I got on very well with our platoon staff, the corporals and the sergeants, and we never had a sort of a full-time officer in charge of us at Puckapunyal. So the sergeant who was in charge, Sergeant Fowler, used to call me the chalky, and because of my teaching. And I can remember one day he pulled me out of whatever we were supposed to be doing, and was coming up to parade, and he wanted me to iron the platoon's shirts. So my job was to iron 30 shirts.
And what an honour that is.
Oh, wonderful.
Must be a highlight of your service.
I was forever grateful to my dear mother for teaching me that.
Of course, there'd probably be a bunch of blokes in there who would have had no idea.
None whatsoever, Nick, and I can remember people writing home within the first week of being at Puckapunyal saying, "I hate the army." And I thought, boy, you're in for a long 2 years.
So you adjusted all right to training. Obviously, playing footy in Melbourne, you must have been at least decently physically capable.
Yeah,
So
they're not a problem.
So not a problem. Yeah, okay. Did you get up to much mischief at all during your training?
Yes.
Such as?
Oh, look, we had a little bit of trouble staying in camp at night. So one of my mates, you have previously interviewed here, had his car at Puckapunyal.
Mr. Linton Malley, not to name names, but,
And so we used to have a regular trip down to Melbourne, or I had taught and played footy up in Benalla the year before, so we used to sneak up there a bit, and we had Normie Rowe was in our hut, and we've headed off to a Normie Rowe concert in Bendigo one night.
And I'm sure the higher-ups had no idea.
None whatsoever.
Yeah.
No, never. He never got caught.
Hey, well, that means it's a victimless crime, I would say.
Absolutely.
If you're going to do something wrong, at least have the decency to do it right and
Absolutely.
not get caught.
No one knew.
So you get to the end of your basic training. How are you feeling at that time?
Well, at one stage at Puckapunyal, Linton and I had sat down, and Linton was a motor mechanic, I was a teacher, and we were discussing doing something quite different. So we decided to volunteer for infantry, and once you volunteer for infantry, that's it, off you go. So we finished Puckapunyal and put on a bus and head off up to Singleton in the Hunter Valley for the infantry training. So that was good. I was quite happy with that.
So there was no thought of maybe volunteering for another branch? You were always sort of set on infantry?
No, not really. Infantry was the first choice, and I think the Armoured Corps was my second choice. Okay. So I didn't want to go into the Education Corps.
So it sounds like, did you know Linton before you had gone over to training?
No, we met first day at Puckapunyal.
Yeah, and still mates to this day, as I understand it?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, very much so.
Yeah, good. Okay, so you go over to training to be an infantryman. How was that?
That was good, because we we were no longer recruits. We were classified as privates then, so we were treated with a little bit more respect.
Oh, really moving up in the world.
Yeah, we were important people. And so that was good. There's still a lot of army nonsense and carry on, but you could see a purpose in it there, and I found it quite educational in a lot of ways. Yeah, it was good.
Since you deferred for a little while, did you find that you were one of the more older and experienced people there, or was it?
Well, when you had been deferred, your intake was always in the first intake of the year. So we were the 11th intake overall, which was early in 1968. So all the ex-teachers, engineers, whoever, anyone that's sort of tertiary qualified was in that group.
Yeah,
So
okay.
while you're a bit older than the 18-year-olds, obviously, there were a lot of other people in the same age group.
So a lot of people in the same boat then.
Yeah.
Feel at least a little superior over the 18 and 19-year-olds?
No, not at all. No superiority in the army.
No, fair enough. Not unless you're ranked superior.
Unless you're silly enough to wear one of these things on your shoulder.
So you did infantry training, and I understand you did jungle training?
Yes, we went from Puckapunyal to Singleton straight to Canungra. That's 3 weeks jungle training, which everybody had to do before going to Vietnam. And it's quite possible that when we had finished at Canungra, that was probably the fittest I've ever been in my life.
Yeah.
Yes, I think, in old terminology, I was about 15 and a half stone, no fat, very fit. It was hard work, Canungra.
Too bad you couldn't go home and play on the wing of some
Yes.
footy oval and just run up and down all day.
It would have been good,
Could have
Nick.
given Robbie Flower a run for his money.
Yes.
So once you're all, trained up and ready to head over to Vietnam, how were you feeling? Were you feeling prepared, or were you just still a bit nervous about the unknown?
Oh, look, when you look back on it, stupidly naive.
Yeah.
Not really much of an idea. I certainly had no idea of the politics of the situation. I can remember one lecture we got at Canungra where we were given some basic information about Viet Cong and Ho Chi Minh and elections that weren't held and so on. But at that age, I went pretty well straight over the head. I didn't take much notice. So we were sent to Vietnam as reinforcements, and there's a reinforcement unit there. So once we got there, we were there for a couple of weeks and then shifted out to a battalion, and we went out to the 1st Battalion. So it wasn't until we got to the 1st Battalion and met people who had been in Vietnam in an operational role for 6 months or so, I guess that the message really started to hit then. Wow, this is real.
If you don't mind me asking, I'm just curious about sort of the mindset that you take going in, because going in to Vietnam, going into what will be a war zone, putting your life on the line for a war that maybe wasn't quite, ringing as true as maybe something like World War II, where it was pretty clear who was, the enemy, why we had to stop them and whatnot. What was the thought process and the mindset going in to a war that maybe was a little less clear-cut, especially as to Australia's involvement?
In the early days of our involvement, Nick, the majority of Australians were quite in favour of it. Within the political context of the mid-1960s, the word communism was like a red flag to most of the world.
Literally.
Yeah. Anybody, there was a politician in America, McCarthy, and he used to talk about communists under the bed and
McCarthyism.
Yeah, and there are people in Australia who will claim that Sir Robert Menzies won an election on exactly that premise. So the first Australian soldiers to go to Vietnam were all senior sergeants and warrant officers, and their role was to train the South Vietnamese Regular Army. And it was only after Mr Menzies decided to increase that commitment, and we needed battalions there, that he suddenly realised we didn't have enough numbers in the regular army to meet that commitment, thus we had the national service. Now, at that time, most people were still pretty much in favour of the war, because they used to peddle around the domino theory that if South Vietnam fell, then so would Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore, Indonesia and Australia. And that was very realistic. There were people that genuinely had a fear of that, and there wasn't too much vocal opposition to Vietnam at that stage. Now, there was some. And it wasn't until a gentleman named Errol Noack was killed in 1960, might have been 68, I'm not sure. But Errol was the first national serviceman killed in Vietnam. And then the issue started to really heat up, and so that evolved, and we finished up with the great moratoriums and the draft resistors and so on. Now, at that stage, we're in Vietnam and we are operational. So, in a fairly naive way, I suppose, we opposed the opposition. Yeah. We were quite in favour of doing what we were doing, and it's not until later years that I really read and understood of what was really going on. And of course, there were people, I think it was Dr. Jim Cairns, a Labor politician at the time, who said there can be nothing good that will ever come out of this. And it was a very prophetic statement. So there was a lady named Jean McLean in Melbourne who started off an organisation, Save Our Sons. It was, protesting against the conscription and the overseas service for conscription. Now, Jean McLean and I think 11 of her colleagues finished up spending time in Fairfield Women's Prison for resisting arrest or some other very, very minor civil offence. And so the opposition built up and built up and built up until, of course, what do we call it, an honourable withdrawal or something? Yeah. And then the Whitlam government halted national service the moment they got in, and so it was all wound down. And then all the other drama starts after that, Agent Orange and so on and so forth.
So back to your own service. So you're ready to ship out. Had you been overseas before?
No.
No. Were you sort of keen to get out of Australia for a bit, or?
Never really thought about it, I don't think, Nick. I can remember flying over Alice Springs and seeing a very green oval down there, and there was a bushfire going on somewhere else, and we landed in Darwin, the plane to be refuelled, and we did a bit of refuelling ourselves. Landing at Tonsanut was a bit of an eye-opener because A, of the heat, B, just the activity. It must have been the busiest airport in the world at that stage. And C, there were a whole lot of Vietnamese people running around doing various jobs, but at the same time scavenging through the rubbish bins looking for any scraps of food or whatever that we may have thrown in there, and that was a little bit of a wake-up call for me. I suddenly started to think, this is a different world.
Yeah.
But, I did enjoy it. Once I got there, I enjoyed a different country, different culture, different. Different.
Yeah, did it take a bit of time to adjust to?
Yeah, well, yes, but you don't really get to understand it because we're living in a very, very protected environment. We were never allowed out in amongst the population as such.
Yeah, of course.
We had a little bit of time off in Vung Tau from time to time, but that was still pretty much a very sanitised environment. We didn't get out into the villages as such.
So you get into Vietnam, you get to Nui Dat, I'm guessing?
Yes, that's where we were posted, Nui Dat.
Yep. And then what did your average day-to-day life over in Vietnam look like?
Well, Nui Dat was the base camp for the operational troops, the infantry and the artillery and the armoured, and Nui Dat, as I understand it, is really Vietnamese for Small Hill, and up on that Small Hill were our SAS troops, so they were in there as well. But so when you were in camp there, it was pretty much normal camp activities, keep your area clean and tidy. We were always, there were sentries out the whole time. There were also patrols out around the area. Nuidat was really was apart from the small hill, was in a rubber plantation. And so there was protective wire around the outside. And as I said, we had sentries on the inside looking out, but we also had patrols going around it the whole time just to make sure there was nobody sneaking up to where they shouldn't be.
Yeah.
That was pretty stock standard. We didn't spend a whole lot of time in there. We spent most of our time out the bush.
Yeah, what was that like?
Good, interesting.
Yeah.
You're sharing your workplace with scorpions and leeches and ants and unfriendly vegetation and snakes and the odd local who didn't want to see you there.
Yeah.
And living out of rations, sentry duty every night, sort of a couple of hours behind a machine gun, one hand on a claymore mine, staring out into the jungle darkness, can't see a thing, some horrible jungle noises going on the whole time, and quite often just a myriad of fireflies. So while you can't see much, there's a lot of sensory stimulation happening, and you sort of had to work out what needed to be taken care of. And fortunately for us, we were never greatly disturbed by anything that was too dangerous at night. But there was the usual, in the Australian Army tradition, stand to every morning. So up at before sunup, into a defensive position, and then a quick breakfast, whatever, and then do what was the designated activity for the day, whether it was patrolling or setting an ambush or doing some sort of a village search, stand down at night and repeat the next day.
Yeah. Were you seeing much of your mate Linton at this point?
Yes, Linton and I were in the same platoon.
There you go.
Yeah, so we were there the whole time. We used to amuse ourselves with silly conversations.
I can't imagine having a silly conversation with him. That's, geez, unthinkable.
Linton was always going to teach me the workings of the internal combustion engine, and I was always going to teach him how to bowl leg spin.
Two equally useful skills.
I had no interest in internal combustion engines and still don't, and Linton still wouldn't know a leg spinner from a volleyball.
So while you were out and about, did you have much contact with the Viet Cong?
Nothing as organised as an ambush on us. We had a couple of ambushes that we put into action. Most of it was almost like an accidental bumping into somebody and a bit of a sporadic fire, and they'd nick off and we'd go into a defensive position and withdraw, and by the time we got ourselves organised, they'd gone. So, no, nothing terribly much in that regard. We're very lucky, really, because we talk to plenty of guys these days who are involved in things like long tan or Coral or Balmoral, and some of them have written books, and we know the welfare needs that exist because of that experience. Yeah, it's very naive. I think I'm quite cranky about successive governments over the years, and even as it's culminated recently with the Royal Commission into veteran suicide, that, as I said, governments have been terribly slack in the welfare area, even though we're probably, or maybe the only country in the world that has a specific Department of Veterans Affairs. It's, over the years, with different governments, been politicised, and without wanting to sound controversial, but the Morrison government were very, very poor, and the Royal Commission has revealed this, and I know from my own work at the Veterans Welfare Centre in Druin that we had applications from vets for assistance, pensions and benefits that were waiting up to 3 years to be processed. And that's just not acceptable. Now, that has improved lately, but I'm not aware of any politician since Vietnam who has really got up and said, "Whoa, that was a mistake. It should never have happened." Not only should it never have happened, I mean, we've repeated it in Afghanistan. So they seem to think that you can pick people up off the street and set them out into a war environment, finish their time and turn them loose and everything will go back to normal. Well, it just doesn't work.
Well, we'll get more in depth with that a bit later in our chat when we sort of talk about your post-war activities. I just wanted to go back to Vietnam when you're out on patrol. Like you said, even though you didn't have many examples of contact with the Viet Cong, what was the mindset, I guess, at the time when, you'd never know if you'll turn around a corner and see, someone pointing a gun at you or something? I mean, it's just a constant state of stress. I mean, for a bloke like yourself, you said you were 22 at the time, were you? Yeah, 22 at the time. I mean, what's that like, being in that sort of environment on a daily basis for weeks at a time?
Nick, perhaps the best way to answer that is if you were able to consider the number of vets who are on what are now called special rate pensions, and special rate is a recent euphemism for totally and permanently impaired. And they are in receipt of that pension because of that stress, not necessarily because of a specific traumatic incident. It's just a build-up over time that gradually impacts on your life. And in my own case, shortly after I came home, I attended a meeting where the Department of Veterans Affairs was outlining the services and benefits that were available, and there were a whole lot of other Vietnam vets there, people who had been home for some time, and the general mood in the room was one of intense negativity. People were grizzling about not being able to claim for a hose that they'd bought or something that I thought at the time was quite trivial. And I left that meeting thinking, wow, that will never happen to me. And so I had very little to do with Vietnam vets or the RSL. The RSL was a slightly different story until some time later on. Now, it got to the point where I was in my, mid-50s, I suppose, and I was like one of those blokes, I never go to the doctor for anything, but somewhere along the line I had to, or maybe it was for a driving licence physical or something, but the doctor started talking to me about these things, and he sent me off for a medical, and he came back and he then arranged for me to sit in front of a psychiatrist, Nick. That was a bit of a shock to the system, me going to a psychiatrist. So I did, and Dr. Paul Collier, and without going into all the whys and wherefores, I was asked or told to resign from work, and I was awarded one of those TPI pensions with PTSD and mid-range depression, anxiety, etc., that I knew I was struggling with some things. I was just having trouble concentrating, getting through a day, and I was drinking too much. And I wasn't really being very good in my relationships, particularly with my wife. And it took all those discussions with the psychiatrist, and then just further experience, I guess, and some reading and working with the welfare centre in Druin was very, very good, that I gradually came to terms with the whole thing.
Did you think about it much at the time?
No.
No.
Didn't know anything about it.
Or just the stressful environment that you were in at the time. Did it affect you much when you were in Vietnam?
I don't remember being frightened. There were times, there were times when I was very frightened. But
Naturally.
but it wasn't, I didn't think an ongoing emotion. It was just something that happened at the time, and afterwards you have a smoke and talk about it, and you go on to the next bit. But
I suppose you didn't really have time to sit with it too much.
no, and it probably wasn't the done thing in that environment,
Yeah.
where we're fighters.
Yeah.
So there was probably that peer group pressure at the time, and I think that would also be a key reason why we rejected the protesters at home. There was a time that the posties, the postal department went on strike and they weren't delivering our mail. So we started writing punch a postie on the envelopes instead of putting where stamps were. So we had that very close bonding. And it's similar to the guys in France in World War One, when Prime Minister Hughes put the plebiscite to the Australian people about conscription for overseas service. The troops in France rejected it. They didn't want people with them who didn't want to be there.
Yeah.
And that's the mentality. And that continues to today. I've got a couple of sort of main reference groups. The people I went to teachers' college with and are still very, very good friends. There's my footballing community, and there's my Vietnam vet mates, as well as people around the town here. But there are a couple of things. The Vietnam vets are dying the quickest of anyone, and there's also a bond in there that, I think, it sounds a bit unkind in a way, but somebody put it a while ago. It's something that we can't explain and you can't understand, and that sounds a bit dismissive, but that's sort of what it is.
Yeah. Well, what was it like with those blokes while you were over there? That sense of mateship and camaraderie.
Still see them today.
Yeah.
I've just in the last week I've spent time with one guy up at Yarrawonga and a couple of nights with another guy in Benalla, and we have in Victoria we've got a little group, 6 or 8 of us, that get together once a year, as well as seeing each other on other odd occasions. And then the battalion has an annual get-together in May of every year, and that was originally put together to commemorate the Battle of Coral, which took place in May in 1968. So that's been going for a long while. This year we're in Adelaide, and then we've got only a couple left after that. We go to Sydney, Hobart, and then the last one will be in Townsville, and that's the 60th anniversary of the Battle of Coral, and that'll be the end of our formal reunions. There might not be any of us left by then.
No, of course. It's a sad reality.
It is, Nick.
So, are there any particular stories that stand out to you from your time in Vietnam? Or looks like there might be.
Look, nothing heroics or anything like that. There were silly little things that happened back in camp that were more about being a bit rebellious, I suppose.
Yeah, tell me a bit about some of those.
Nick, when we were assigned to the 1st Battalion, they'd been in Vietnam about 6 months, and their normal tour is 12 months. So we stayed with them for 6 months, and they came home, and they were replaced by the 5th Battalion. So we were then assigned to the 5th Battalion so that we could finish our 12 months. And when 5RA got there, I think in that our little group of reinforcements who went to 1RA, we had been given 2 days leave at Vung Tau. And that's all we'd had in sort of 7 months or 8 months or whatever it was at the time. And 5RA had been there a little while, and they were taken off to Vung Tau for leave, and all the ex-1RA people were left behind to look after the camp, sentry and all that sort of stuff. Well, dear, oh dear, oh dear. That's not good. So we were on duty on the Saturday afternoon, and all hanging around down at the weapons, the gun pit, and I looked over the shoulder, and there's the company boozer up there, and I thought, well, there's got to be a bit of rest and recreation in there. So we headed off, and the windows into the boozer were just louvers, so we could just get a couple of them out. And we raced in and grabbed a couple of cartons of cool beverage, and I wrote on the wall that McNab owes for 3 cartons. So there was no intention to steal or mislead anybody. So we'd gone off and had a good night. Next day must have woken up with terribly guilty consciences. So we've gone hiking around the camp to try and replace the 3 cartons, which we managed to do, and but broke a window as we were trying to put it all back together. And so when the 5RA people came back, it was quite obvious that somebody had been where they shouldn't have been. And they've disregarded what I'd written on the wall, and they start this great investigation. Well, am I allowed to use an inappropriate word here? No, all right, I won't. So we are being questioned. Linton Melly and a red-headed shearer from outback Western Australia named Bluey O'Neill, the most laconic, easy-going, funny man I've ever met, and myself. And this officer is firing us questions. And I just think this is so stupid because the answer is written on the wall. They're asking us this, and I thought, well, I'll play you a silly game. So we're going backwards and forwards with all this sort of stuff. And this officer, you know, blokes come out of Duntroon and they think that they're pretty good and different class and they have respect and all this. Anyway, this bloke finally said to Blue, Private O'Neill, as far as I can see, you went in and took 3 cartons, but replaced 4. Blue stopped and said, gee, sure, I hope not. And if you can put the correct word in there for gee, the poor old officer, his face fell. We fell over each other laughing, and we were guilty at that point, of course, and had to endure, 9 days of field punishment or something. So one day we're on this field punishment, and the duty sergeant had us filling sandbags. Filling sandbags. And I was going all right, and Bluey O'Neill came over and emptied mine. I thought, God, O'Neill, that is outrageous. So next minute we're having a sandbag fight, and the sergeant came by and he says, you blokes aren't taking this seriously, are you? No, go, leave. But it was just an example of our, I guess, not contempt, but disrespect for a lot of the army procedures, and the poor officer who was the subject of Blue's comment just wasn't used to being spoken to like that.
I just can't get over the fact that you basically signed off on your crime with your own name and they still couldn't figure it out.
Oh, well, Nick, as I said, we never about... we were really cranky about them going and leaving us there, but we would never have deliberately set out to steal. It wasn't going to fly. When I look back at the whole thing, I mean, after, I think I was in Vietnam for 10 months. I had 2 days leave in Vung Tau and 5 days R&R in Taipei, and that was all the leave we had in the 10 months. Yeah, so it was good to get home away from that.
Well, you get to the end of your 10 months, your time in Vietnam's coming to an end, you're about to ship off. How were you feeling at that point?
It was good to go home. I had suffered a bout of, I guess you'd call it dengue fever, and I'd spent 10 days in hospital down in Vung Tau. I guess I was bitten by a mosquito or something, but I was very, very sick and unwell, so I didn't really spend much time out the bush after that. I came home, or back to Nui Dat rather, and then it wasn't long after that we got the order that we were to be sent home and to rejoin OneRA in Malaysia. So we were shipped out a couple of months earlier than was originally intended, And so we were home in June or July or something like that. And that was good, yeah.
Yeah.
I had a month at home and then rejoined One Ra in Malaysia, which was mainly, I suppose you'd call it a peacekeeping force. It was some sort of a ceremonial gesture as a follow-up to the Malaysian campaign. There was some sort of a communist uprising in parts of Indonesia and coming in, not Indonesia, in Malaysia. And so the British had a camp set up at, what was it, Terendak? It was near, I can't think of the name of the place. Anyway, so that's where we were. And there'd been Australian troops there for many years and an Air Force base on Butterworth. We were there for 6 months and it was mostly, we played a lot of sport and did a lot of guard duty and that sort of stuff.
Yeah, so a little more easy to swallow than... some of the stuff
Absolutely.
you've
In
been
fact, it was a very nice letdown. We didn't come straight out of the jungle and back into civilian life. We had that sort of 6 months to wind down in a way with people that we'd been in the jungle with, and that was good.
So you eventually come home. How did you find it when you came home? Did you adjust back to civilian life or not?
No.
No. Short answer.
Yeah. I went back to teaching, and that first year back was very, very hard.
Yeah, you sort of hinted at that earlier in our chat. That
Yeah, I couldn't. It was really difficult. Then the education department did something good. They declared that because we had missed 2 years teaching experience, that they would give us time off on full pay to do additional study if we wished to. And it was 1 year's full-time leave and then part-time leave, still on full pay, to complete the course. So I took advantage of that and enrolled in a course at Swinburne, and in doing that, I bumped into a couple of other guys, same situation, one of whom I'd been at Teachers College with, so we ended up in a flat in Hawthorn, and for the next 3 years were probably the 3 funniest years in my life. We only had about 9 hours a week face-to-face lecture time, so we managed multiple rounds of golf each week. Barely missed a midweek race meeting from Ballarat to Werribee to Mornington. One of the guys with us was a gentleman named Mick Mulligan, and Mick was playing footy with Williamstown at that stage, and Williamstown were backed by a couple of big bookmakers, so we'd head off to the races and Mick would go and talk to his bookmaker mates, and we'd come back with a couple of surefire bets and put our enormous $5 on them. And at the end of the day, we were $20 or $30 in front. That was an absolute fortune. That got us enough beer for the rest of the week, and away we'd go again.
all of this on the Department of Education's dime.
Absolutely. It was well worth it, yes.
As you should do. So as a returned serviceman from Vietnam, obviously some service people coming home from Vietnam found the reception a bit frosty. Obviously, as you discussed before, opinion on the war had sort of taken a turn. How did you find it personally?
I had no problems. My parents at that stage had moved off the farm and lived in Frankston. I had played football in Frankston before I went, and I'd been at Teachers College in Frankston, so I had a wonderful family and a very good social and sporting network there as well. So that was fine at a surface level, but just couldn't settle down. It was just very, very hard. And I got married, I think 2 or 3 years later, and that was the best thing. That really did settle me down, and life started to take a more normal course at that point. Although I was still, a bit shaky when I look back on it now. At the time, I didn't think I was.
Yeah.
In fact, at the time, I probably thought I was just Butte, but
Invincible.
I wasn't.
Yeah. I think that's maybe a bit of a common theme, especially, we talk about these days, blokes talking about their mental health and struggles, trying to erase the stigma. I can only imagine what it might have been like, 40, 50 years ago.
The difficulty, and it's the same with all of these issues, is accepting that there is a problem and recognising it and having a clear and honest understanding of exactly where you are and then an understanding of where you're wanting to be and being able to connect the dots. But I had no idea, really, of where I was. I thought I did, but I didn't in hindsight.
Yeah, I suppose that's just the benefit of time and, as you say, hindsight, that you look back and sort of...
Well, that's true, Nick, but you do a bit of damage. I mean, my first marriage ended primarily because I couldn't see exactly what I was doing, and I was being quite disrespectful of the relationship. I wasn't doing anything immoral or illegal or anything. It was just my general behaviour wasn't respectful of the relationship, and that ultimately has a price, of course. Now, I'm very fortunate. I've got two wonderful children who survived that, and not only survived it, but still we have a wonderful relationship with both of them. But you can't do anything about it. It's done. You move on. So, I mean, I've since married for a second time to Beverly, who's an absolutely beautiful lady, and we live out at Rokeby, and all is well.
I wanted to sort of move forward to some of the stuff that you've done post-war. Obviously, you've talked about this a decent amount, you sort of keeping in touch with your fellow veterans and sort of the activities you do there. But I was hoping, and you've talked about it already a bit, you might want to touch on your time at the Gippsland Veterans Welfare Centre, and then maybe a bit on your time as current president of the Druin RSL, just some of those activities that you've done to sort of support your fellow veterans.
Yes, well, I retired as a result of my visits to the psychiatrist that I mentioned earlier. It was recommended that I retire. I was employed by Gips TAFE at that stage. Gips TAFE obviously have a campus here in Warrigal, and then Leongatha and Morwell and Yallourn, but they have one down at Chadstone too, and that's where I was working from. And it was recommended that I retire and address these physical and mental issues. So I did that, and I'd met Bevy at that stage, and we had married, and I was living out at Rokeby, and I joined the Druin RSL primarily because Dad had been a member there in the late 50s and early 60s, but they had all of their meetings and activities on a Friday, which while I was working you couldn't partake. And so there I saw in the paper a special meeting had been called to discuss the future of the sub-branch, and it was going to be held on a Sunday. So I thought I'd head off there, which I did, and came away as secretary, which was a bit of a surprise. And that continued for a couple of years until the then president moved out of the area, and I was elected to the president's role. I think that was 13 years ago, I'm not sure, but I feel very humble and privileged to be in that position. You're a wonderful group of people whose concern for each other's welfare is significant. In fact, this afternoon, sadly, we have the funeral for one of our dear members. She's 91 and has just been such a wonderful, wonderful contributor to that group. So that has been, as I said, significant, and I'm very proud and to be in that role. I have almost zero affection for the RSL as an organisation. I just think that they are just out of touch with the reality, and the recent commission into veteran suicide, I hope, will give things a bit of a shake-up there. In the course of that role at the RSL, I, of course, bumped into a gentleman named Brian Milner and his wife Sue, who at that stage was involved in the RSL, but he was also instrumental in the establishment of the Veterans Welfare Centre at Druin. And he asked me would I like to consider becoming an advocate there, which I did, and I underwent the training and found the process. The welfare centre, of course, is for people who have an issue resulting from their Defence Force service to come and apply or get advice on what benefits and pensions or whatever may be available to them. And I just found that whole process to be a very, very positive one. Number one, you're helping somebody with something that they're not familiar with. But in a more selfish vein, I just found it cathartic to be there talking to somebody. And I've always believed if you want to get information from somebody, the best way is to give some. So I found myself talking about myself to these people in the hope that that would give them the confidence to open up and talk about whatever problems they have, because we're talking to mostly males who have got issues with mental health primarily, or a physical problem that is causing a mental problem, and they need to be able to talk about that, because in making the application to the department, we need to be able to write all that down, explain this is the scenario and this is the impact that it's having on this veteran's life, etc. And that's what the final decision. So that was a very positive experience. And unfortunately, the welfare centre, due to, well, I guess we just run out of puff. It's had to close down, but the Warragul RSL will take it up, and they're in the process of building a room and training personnel to do it. So it will continue to exist. It's an extremely valuable organisation in for what it provides. It's also a let-off for the government, because the work that we have been doing voluntarily really should be done by the Department of Veterans Affairs, and my optimistic dream, which will never ever eventuate, is that somewhere out there on the green hills of Gippsland we'll have a big building, and in the building will be representatives of the RSL and Legacy and the Department of Veterans Affairs, and we might even have access to psychologists and other health specialists, and we'll have conference rooms and so on and so forth. So we'll have all these services in one centralised location, so that when people are being discharged from the ADF, that's where they go. And data can be taken and records kept, because at the moment, as far as I understand it, all that is very, very lax. People get discharged and disappear into the wild blue yonder, and they shouldn't. They should be tracked and monitored and continually assessed for until such time as they're deemed safe to let go.
Seems like you've been in a battle with bureaucracy for a long time now.
Oh, look, Nick. Yes.
So I suppose my final real question is, now we've talked a bit about having the benefit of hindsight, and with that in mind, how do you reflect on your time in Vietnam almost 60 years later?
When I stand up before the people of Druin on occasions like Anzac Day and Remembrance Day, and I'm wearing my service medals, I feel very, very proud that I'm wearing the service medals, and the knowledge that I quite honestly and diligently and to the best of my ability served my nation. It has a little bit of the shine taken off when I look back at the circumstances under which that service was derived. It was a terrible decision, and seemingly nothing was learnt from it, because it has been repeated in Afghanistan, and people don't seem to understand that back in World War I and aspects of World War II, the war was over territory, but Vietnam wasn't over territory, it was over an idea and a philosophy. And, you've got millions and millions of people following a hero, as Ho Chi Minh was to those people, and it doesn't matter how many you kill, You're not going to eradicate the idea. And in Afghanistan, of course, we've got centuries and centuries of tribal warfare and people living in villages who have no idea of democracy or whatever else we were theoretically pursuing over there. It's just a pointless exercise. You can never, ever defeat it in terms of military. And I was sort of the other day listening to Pete Hegseth, who's President Trump's advisor on defence or whatever his title is, and they were talking to him about the issue with Ukraine and asking him about President Zelensky standing up for principles and values. And he said, you can have principles and values, but ultimately you need power. And that just sums up the United States approach to the whole thing. As long as it's bigger and better and you can shoot more of them or drop more bombs or whatever, you will eventually win. Well, no, you don't. And I feel very sorry for President Zelensky, but that's the sort of the slight smudge on my time in Vietnam.
Well, I think that brings us to the end of our chat today. I want to thank you very much for your time today, Rod, and your candidness and your openness with a lot of your answers, especially those more personal aspects. You know, I imagine it's taken you some time to become comfortable talking about that sort of stuff, and we very much appreciate just how open you have been today. So thank you very much for coming in today and sharing your story.
Thank you, Nick. It has been an interesting journey, and it continues.
And long may it continue.
Thanks,
you.
mate.
The Warragul and Druin Gazette and the Warragul RSL would like to thank our guests for sharing their opinions and recollections of their service in Vietnam, as well as their later experiences after returning back into civilian life.